We often view Victorian London through a soft, nostalgic haze, a world of steam engines, velvet waistcoats, and the rapid birth of the modern age. But beneath the refinement lay a terrifying, invisible reality we usually choose to ignore. Stand on the banks of the Thames today, and you see a living, breathing river. But in the sweltering summer of 1858, you would have looked upon a thick, black, fermented soup of human waste. The stench was so aggressive it threatened the very seat of global power. Members of Parliament were reduced to soaking their heavy window curtains in chloride of lime, desperate to filter the air just enough to survive their own debates. Even the Crown was not safe from the miasma. Queen Victoria attempted a brief pleasure cruise on the water, only to abandon the vessel after mere minutes, overcome by the fumes and forced into a humiliating retreat. Under a relentless, record-breaking heat wave, the river began to physically bubble and ferment, turning the heart of the world's greatest empire into a massive, open-air sewer. If you enjoy losing yourself in the darker corners of history, I'd be honored to have you join us here. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Now let the world around you fade. Settle into your seat as we travel back to the suffocating summer that changed sanitation forever. Imagine the skyline of London in the middle of the 19th century. It is not the clean, postcard-perfect silhouette we recognize today, but a jagged horizon of soot-stained brick and belching chimney stacks, permanently shrouded in a yellow-gray haze of coal smoke. To walk these streets was to be crushed by the sheer weight of humanity. By the 1850s, London had become the largest city the world had ever seen, the beating heart of a global empire that stretched across every ocean. Yet beneath the veneer of Victorian progress and industrial might, the city was choking on its own success. To understand how the Great Stink happened, we have to look at the numbers, and they are staggering. In 1801, the first official census recorded just under 1 million people living within the city limits. It was a crowded city, yes, but one that functioned within its means. But then the explosion happened. In just 40 years, that population doubled. By the time our story reaches its peak, nearly 2.5 million souls were packed into the same ancient footprint. This was a demographic earthquake. People arrived from the countryside in search of work, cramming into every available attic, basement, and alleyway. The city was expanding outward and upward, but the ground beneath it remained anchored in the medieval past. For centuries, London had managed its waste through a system that was as foul as it was functional, the night soil collection. It was a crude form of recycling. Every house had a cesspit, a brick-lined hole in the ground, usually located in the cellar or the small backyard. These pits collected everything. When they were full, the night soil men would arrive under the cover of darkness. They were a hardy, desperate class of laborers who would climb down into the filth, shovel it into wicker baskets, and haul it away in horse-drawn carts. This waste was a valuable commodity. It was sold to farmers in the surrounding counties of Middlesex and Kent to fertilize the crops that fed the city. It was a closed loop. The city ate, the city produced waste, and that waste grew more food. But as the population surged, the loop began to snap. The city grew so large that the farms were pushed further and further away. Suddenly, the cost of transporting the night soil exceeded its value as fertilizer. The night soil men began to raise their prices, and the homeowners, many of them living in grinding poverty, simply couldn't pay. The cesspits stopped being emptied. They began to overflow, seeping into the foundations of houses, saturating the soil, and creating a permanent, stagnant marsh of human refuse beneath the floorboards of the world's most powerful capital. Then, a technological marvel arrived that promised to solve everything: the water closet. It was the height of modern luxury. Patented and refined by inventors like Joseph Brahma, the flush toilet was marketed as a miracle of hygiene. It allowed the wealthy and the growing middle class to whisk their waste away with the pull of a handle and a rush of water. No more smells, no more unsightly buckets. By the 1840s, the water closet was the must-have appliance for any respectable London household. But this clean invention was the very thing that triggered the catastrophe. The Victorian engineers made a fatal assumption. They believed that by flushing the waste away from the home, the problem was solved. But where was that water going? The water closets were connected to the existing house drains, which were originally designed only to carry away the overflow from cesspits. The massive volume of water used by these new toilets quickly overwhelmed the pits, turning them into bubbling fountains of filth. To stop the basements from flooding, the authorities made a decision that would haunt them for decades. They allowed, and eventually mandated, that these drains be connected to the city's street sewers. These sewers were never meant for sewage. They were ancient, crumbling brick tunnels designed solely to funnel rainwater into the River Thames to prevent street flooding. Suddenly, these channels were being fed a relentless, high-pressure stream of human waste from hundreds of thousands of new toilets. The river, which had once been a source of salmon and a place for recreation, was transformed in a matter of years into an open, tidal sewer. The irony was absolute. In their quest for domestic cleanliness, the people of London had traded a private problem for a public disaster. They were cleaning their homes by poisoning their front yard. The Thames was not just a scenic backdrop for the Houses of Parliament, it was the city's primary source of drinking water. As the tide moved in and out, it acted like a giant piston, pushing the filth up and down the length of the city, never fully washing it out to sea. The very water that people used to cook their food and tea was the same water that held the city's excrement. The stage was set. The population had peaked, the infrastructure had failed, and the river was a ticking biological time bomb. All that was needed was the right spark to set off a crisis. That spark would come in the form of a record-breaking heat wave. By June of 1858, the temperature in London began to climb toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and with it, the river began to churn. But to understand why a mere smell could paralyze the capital of the world's greatest empire, we have to understand how the Victorians perceived the very nature of death itself. They did not fear what they could not see, they feared what they could smell. This was the era of miasma theory, a centuries-old medical dogma that dictated the way every person in London moved through their day. The word itself, derived from the Greek for pollution, suggested a world where disease was a vapor, a ghostly fog rising from decomposing matter. In the mid-19th century, this was not some fringe superstition held by the uneducated. It was the undisputed consensus of the most brilliant minds in medicine and governance. To the Victorian nose, the stench of the Thames was not just a nuisance or a byproduct of urban life, it was a poisonous cloud. The prevailing belief held that the foul odors of the slums, the overcrowded graveyards, and the open sewers were the actual agents of cholera, typhus, and plague. If the air was heavy with the scent of rot, the air was the killer. This logic created a terrifying feedback loop. The more the river stank, the more certain the public became that a massive, citywide cull was imminent. They believed that bad air directly corrupted the blood, and that one deep breath of the river's fumes could be a death sentence. It was a paradigm that made the nose the primary organ of survival. Yet 4 years before the heat of 1858 turned the Thames into a literal cauldron, a quiet and observant physician named John Snow had already looked into the abyss and seen a different truth. During the devastating cholera outbreak of 1854 in the Soho district, Snow did something radical for the time. He gathered data. He walked the streets of Golden Square, talking to the families of the bereaved and mapping the location of every death with meticulous precision. He noticed a chilling pattern that defied the laws of miasma. The deaths were not clustered in the narrowest, smelliest alleys. Instead, they radiated out from a single point, the public water pump on Broad Street. Snow's theory was simple, revolutionary, and deeply unpopular. He argued that cholera was not an atmospheric poison inhaled through the lungs, but a waterborne pathogen ingested through the gut. It was a living thing, an invisible passenger in the water supply. To prove his point, Snow famously convinced the local parish authorities to remove the handle of the Broad Street pump. Almost immediately, the local epidemic collapsed. It should have been a triumph of modern science, a turning point that saved thousands of lives. But the medical establishment was not ready to listen. The guardians of London's health, led by powerful figures like the sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick and the prominent statistician William Farr, were wedded to the miasma. They viewed Snow's germ theory as an eccentric distraction. To accept that disease was carried in the water would mean acknowledging a catastrophic failure of their own design. For years, Chadwick had championed a sanitary system that used water to flush waste out of the homes of the wealthy and into the river. He believed that by removing the smell from the houses, he was removing the disease. In reality, he was merely moving the pathogen from the bedroom to the kitchen table, dumping it into the very river that many of the city's private companies used to provide drinking water. Even as Snow published his findings, the General Board of Health issued a formal report flatly rejecting his conclusions. They argued that the local atmosphere around Broad Street was sufficiently vitiated to account for the deaths. They were trapped in a mindset where the sensory experience of a smell outweighed the cold evidence of a map. They preferred the devil they knew, the invisible mist, over the invisible microbes, Snow suggested. Because the establishment ignored Snow, the city's infrastructure continued to funnel every ounce of human waste directly into the Thames, even as the population exploded. By the time the record-breaking heat of 1858 arrived, the river was no longer a waterway. It was an open, fermenting sewer. To the people of London, the rising stench was the literal breath of death. They believed the river was finally exhaling the miasma that would end the empire. As the sun beat down and the water levels dropped, the city was convinced it was smelling its own funeral pyre. This was the intellectual climate of the Great Stink, a city terrified of a smell, led by men who refused to look at the water. But the failure to look at the water was more than a collective delusion. It was a structural paralysis. While the Thames simmered with the waste of 2.5 million people, the halls of Westminster remained locked in a different kind of stagnation. If the river was thick with sludge, the government was thick with bureaucracy. The story of London's inaction is a story of a city that tried to organize its way out of a crisis without actually spending a penny to fix it. The struggle began in earnest a decade before the Great Stink, with the formation of the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers in 1848. On paper, it was a revolutionary idea. For the first time, a single body would oversee the underground labyrinth of a city that had previously been managed by 8 different squabbling local authorities. It was supposed to be the dawn of a unified scientific approach to the city's bowels. Instead, it became a revolving door of frustration. Between 1848 and 1855, no fewer than 6 separate commissions were appointed and dissolved. It was a dizzying cycle of administrative chaos. Each new group of commissioners arrived with grand ambitions, only to find themselves drowning in the same sea of indecision that had swallowed their predecessors. They spent their days in endless committee meetings, surrounded by mountains of blue books and hand-drawn maps of tunnels that would never be dug. They were tasked with solving a problem of unprecedented scale, yet they were handcuffed by the very philosophy that defined the Victorian era, a deep-seated, almost religious devotion to laissez-faire government. This hands-off approach meant that while the state acknowledged a problem existed, it was loath to interfere with private property or to levy the taxes necessary for a solution. Every proposal was met with a chorus of objections regarding the cost. To the mid-Victorian mind, a massive public works project funded by the taxpayer was not just expensive, it was a threat to the natural order of the economy. The government's role was to stay out of the way, even if the way was currently blocked by several feet of human excrement. Adding to this political gridlock was a fierce intellectual civil war known as the Battle of the Pipes. On one side stood the reformers like Edwin Chadwick, who advocated for a system of small, high-pressure stoneware pipes that would theoretically flush waste away before it could rot. On the other side were the traditionalists and established engineers who insisted that only massive, man-sized brick tunnels could handle the volume of a city like London. The two factions spent years arguing over flow rates and pipe diameters, while the existing sewers continued to crumble. Hundreds of individual plans were submitted to the commissions by hopeful engineers and eccentric inventors. Some suggested massive chemical treatment plants. Others proposed hauling the waste out of the city by rail to be used as fertilizer. Every plan was debated, every plan was scrutinized, and every plan was eventually filed away in a drawer to gather dust. By the mid-1850s, the public's patience was wearing thin. The press began to lampoon the commissioners as a collection of do-nothings who were more interested in their own titles than in the health of the public. The Times of London frequently pointed out that while the commissions debated the merits of various brick shapes, the mortality rate in the city's poorest districts continued to climb. It was a period of frantic inactivity. The city was growing at a rate that defied comprehension, adding thousands of new residents and thousands of new water closets every year, all of which pumped more pressure into a system that was already failing. In 1855, In a final attempt to break the deadlock, the government created the Metropolitan Board of Works. It was meant to be the definitive solution, led by a determined engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. But even this new body found itself paralyzed from the start. Bazalgette spent his first years in office submitting 5 different comprehensive schemes for a main drainage system. Each time, he was rebuffed by the first Commissioner of Works, Sir Benjamin Hall, or by the Treasury, usually on the grounds that his designs were too expensive or that the proposed outfall points were too close to the city. The bureaucracy had become a self-sustaining machine of delay. It was a perfect storm of technical disagreement, financial stinginess, and political cowardice. The leaders of the greatest empire on earth were effectively held hostage by their own refusal to spend money on something as unglamorous as a sewer. They waited for a sign, for some undeniable force to compel them to act. They were waiting for the river to stop being a distant nuisance and start being an immediate threat. As the spring of 1858 turned into an unusually hot June, the time for debating pipe diameters and tax rates was about to come to a violent, suffocating end. The bureaucracy was about to be broken by the very thing it had tried so hard to ignore. The calendar flipped to June 1858, and with it, the mercy of the spring rain vanished. What followed was not a typical English summer, but a relentless, heavy heat that seemed to press down on the city like a leaden blanket. For weeks the sun beat down on the brick and stone of London, baking the streets and drying the tributaries that fed into the Thames. This was not merely a warm spell, it was an atmospheric anomaly that turned the city's heart into a pressure cooker. As the temperature climbed past 30 degrees Celsius and stayed there, the river, the ancient artery of the empire, began to surrender. The bureaucracy, which had spent years arguing over the diameter of brick sewers and the legalities of property taxes, suddenly found its deliberations rendered irrelevant by the sheer physical reality of the water. The Thames was no longer a river in any ecological sense. It had become a slow-moving, viscous, ink-black trench. The tides, which usually provided a sense of movement and renewal, now served only to churn the waste back and forth, concentrating it into a thick, putrid slurry. At low tide, the receding water exposed acres of mud, not earth, but a deep gray-black deposit of human excrement, offal from the slaughterhouses and chemical runoff from the tanneries. Under the glare of the June sun, this expanse of filth began to bake. The transformation was visual as well as olfactory. The water itself lost its transparency, turning a deep, oily black that swallowed the light. It moved with a heavy, syrupy consistency, as if the very liquid was too burdened with waste to flow. Then the fermentation began. This was the moment the chronic ailment of London became a violent, acute emergency. The heat was so intense that it triggered a massive chemical reaction within the depths of the river. The layers of waste on the riverbed began to cook, releasing vast plumes of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Witnesses described the surface of the Thames as boiling without a fire. Great bubbles of foul gas, some the size of cannonballs, would rise from the riverbed, bursting at the surface with a wet, sickening pop. Each burst released a concentrated cloud of stench so potent it could literally knock a man sideways. The river was alive, but only in the way a decomposing corpse is alive with the movement of decay. This was not just a bad smell, it was a physical assault. The stench was a thick, cloying miasma that seemed to have weight and texture. It clung to the back of the throat and left a metallic, bitter taste on the tongue. It seeped through the cracks of the finest houses and the thickest stone walls. In the corridors of the newly built Palace of Westminster, the lawmakers of the British Empire, the men who controlled a quarter of the globe, found themselves reduced to gagging into their handkerchiefs. They soaked their heavy curtains in chloride of lime, a desperate attempt to chemically neutralize the air. But the river was louder than their chemistry. The great stink had arrived, and it was a sovereign power that recognized no parliamentary privilege. Beneath the surface, the last vestiges of the river's ecosystem collapsed in an instant. The Thames had been struggling for decades, but the heat wave of 1858 was the final blow. The oxygen levels in the water plummeted to zero as the fermentation process consumed every available molecule. The fish, already scarce, died in their thousands. Their silver bellies glinted briefly on the black surface before they were swallowed by the sludge. The eels, famous for their resilience in even the foulest conditions, surfaced for air, only to find the atmosphere above as toxic as the water below. They died in the mud, adding their rot to the city's waste. The river was now a biological desert, a dead zone in the middle of the most modern city on Earth. Londoners watched in a state of growing terror. In the mid-19th century, the dominant medical theory was miasma, the belief that diseases like cholera and typhus were carried by foul air. To the Victorian mind, the great stink was not just an inconvenience, it was the smell of impending mass death. Every bubble that broke on the surface of the river was seen as a microscopic bomb, releasing the seeds of an epidemic that would surely wipe out the capital. The heat wave had acted as a magnifying glass, focusing the sun's energy onto the city's greatest failure until it finally caught fire. The time for debate was over because the air itself had become an enemy, and the river that had built the empire was now threatening to pull it down into the black, bubbling mud. The fire on the water was merely the opening act of a biological siege. By June of 1858, the temperature had climbed to 94 degrees in the shade, and the city of London found itself trapped in a humid, breathless grip. For years, the stench of the Thames had been a quiet, background companion to the destitute living in the crowded rookeries of the East End. It was the smell of the poor, a byproduct of progress that the ruling class could afford to ignore as long as it stayed confined to the slums. But as the sun baked the tidal mud into a crust of fermenting filth, the wind shifted. The geography of misery was about to expand, and for the first time in history, the geography of power was directly in its path. Inside the Palace of Westminster, the newly completed home of the British government, the air began to change. It started as a faint, sickly sweet odor that drifted through the Gothic corridors, but within hours it had thickened into something physical, something aggressive. This was no longer just a bad smell. It was a thick, invisible fog of putrefaction that seemed to coat the back of the throat. The very men who had spent decades debating the costs of sewage reform, often dismissing the cries of sanitarians as expensive fantasies, were suddenly forced to confront the reality of their own neglect. The scene inside the House of Commons descended into something approaching a farce. Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, stood to address the House, only to find himself clutching a lavender-scented handkerchief to his face, his voice muffled and his eyes watering. Other members of Parliament followed suit, huddled over their benches with their faces buried in silks and linens, looking less like the leaders of a global empire and more like victims of a gas attack. The grand windows, designed to offer a majestic view of the river that had built London's wealth, were slammed shut and bolted. But the heat of the summer made the interior of the chamber an oven, and the stench seemed to seep through the very stones of the building. The irony was thick enough to touch. For a generation, these men had watched from a distance as cholera and typhoid ravaged the working classes, attributing the deaths to the moral failings of the poor or the unavoidable tolls of urban life. They had sat in these same leather seats and voted down funding for a modern sewer system, arguing over the rights of private companies and the burden on the taxpayer. But nature does not respect social hierarchy. The river, which had become a 200-mile-long open sewer, was finally serving its notice. It was no longer just the great stink of the papers. It was a legislative emergency. In a desperate, panicked attempt to reclaim their workspace, the authorities turned to the only tools they had: chemicals. The sergeant-at-arms ordered massive quantities of chloride of lime to be brought into the building. Laborers were seen frantically drenching the heavy wool curtains in the chemical solution, hoping the harsh medicinal sting of the bleach would neutralize the odor of the river. They poured gallons of the white powder onto the riverbanks directly outside the windows, trying to create a chemical barrier between the Parliament and the tide. It was a spectacular failure. Instead of masking the smell, the chloride of lime combined with the fermenting gases of the Thames to create a new, even more nauseating cocktail of aromas. The air became a stinging, acrid haze that burnt the eyes and lungs of the MPs. It was the ultimate humiliation for the Victorian elite. They had conquered the Indian subcontinent and established trade routes across every ocean, yet they were being defeated by their own toilets. As the days passed and the heat showed no sign of breaking, the panic moved from the legislative to the judicial. The law courts, also situated near the river, became uninhabitable. Judges, draped in their heavy robes and traditional wigs, found it impossible to concentrate on the finer points of English law while fighting the urge to vomit. Serious discussions began behind closed doors about the unthinkable, abandoning London altogether. There were formal proposals to move the government and the law courts to Oxford or St. Albans. The idea that the capital of the world's most powerful empire might have to be evacuated because of a smell was the ultimate indictment of their stewardship. The powerful had finally learned what the powerless had known for decades. You can ignore a problem as long as it stays on the other side of the tracks, but eventually the tide comes in. The great stink had achieved what decades of scientific evidence and humanitarian pleading could not. It had made the crisis personal for the men with the pens and the purses. The debate was over, not because of a sudden shift in morality, but because the elite could no longer breathe. The river had brought the empire to its knees, and the only question left was how much they were willing to pay to survive it. The survival of London in the sweltering July of 1858 was no longer a matter of debate or social theory. It had become a visceral struggle for breath. As the curtains of the House of Commons were soaked in chloride of lime to mask the stench of the Thames, the men inside realized that their wealth and status provided no filter against the airborne poison of the river. The great stink had achieved what decades of reformers, scientists, and grieving mothers could not. It had finally terrified the ruling class. This terror did not lead to the usual years of parliamentary bickering or committee-led delays. Instead, it triggered a legislative explosion. In a display of speed that was almost unheard of in the Victorian era, the government moved with the frantic energy of a man gasping for air. Within just 18 days, a period of time that would usually barely suffice for the first reading of a minor bill, the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act was drafted, debated, and passed into law. It was a surrender. Parliament effectively admitted that the city was a death trap and that they were powerless to fix it through traditional means. They did two things that changed the course of urban history. They authorized a staggering sum of £3 million, a figure so vast it would be worth hundreds of millions today, and they handed the keys to the city to one man. This wasn't just a contract, it was a mandate to perform open-heart surgery on the largest metropolis in the world. The man chosen for this impossible task was Joseph Bazalgette. To understand the scale of the responsibility placed on his shoulders, one must look past the stiff, formal photographs of the era. Bazalgette was not an aristocrat or a career politician. He was a creature of the Industrial Revolution, a man whose mind had been forged in the high-pressure world of railway engineering. He had spent his early career working under the legends of the age, learning the uncompromising language of iron, stone, and gravity. He was a man of extreme, almost obsessive attention to detail. While others saw London as a collection of neighborhoods and historic landmarks, Bazalgette saw it as a hydraulic system that had terminally failed. He had been serving as the chief engineer to the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers for years, watching in silent frustration as plan after plan was shelved by bureaucrats who were more concerned with the cost of bricks than the cost of human lives. He had spent his nights poring over elevation maps, memorizing the subtle rise and fall of every street, alleyway, and slum, from the heights of Hampstead down to the marshy lowlands of the East End. He knew exactly where the water wanted to go, and more importantly, he knew exactly why it was currently trapped, fermenting in the basements of millions. When the call finally came, Bazalgette didn't celebrate. He knew the sheer physical weight of the task. He was being asked to drain London, a phrase that sounded simple enough on paper, but was in reality a feat of engineering that bordered on the mythological. He had to construct a massive network of intercepting sewers that would catch the city's waste before it ever reached the Thames, carrying it miles away to the east, where the tide could sweep it out to sea. This meant digging hundreds of miles of tunnels through a chaotic underground world of existing gas pipes, water mains, and ancient forgotten burials. Bazalgette's personality was his greatest tool. He was a relentless perfectionist who refused to trust the standard materials of the day. He knew that the acid and the sheer volume of the waste would eat through traditional mortar. To combat this, he insisted on the use of Portland cement, a relatively new and unproven material at the time. He didn't just order it. He established a rigorous testing regime, checking the strength of every single batch to ensure that his tunnels would last for centuries. He was building for a future London that would house 10 million people, even though the city he stood in only held a fraction of that number. The weight of this responsibility was constant and crushing. He was not just responsible for the £3 million of taxpayer money, he was responsible for the health of an empire. If his calculations were off by even a fraction of an inch per mile, the gravity-fed system would fail, and the waste would simply back up into the streets once again, likely ending any hope of a permanent solution for a generation. He worked 16-hour days, personally inspecting the construction sites and facing down the intense scrutiny of a skeptical press. The newspapers, which had previously mocked the stink traps of the city, now watched Bazalgette with a mixture of desperate hope and predatory expectation. As the first shovels hit the ground, the magnitude of the war he was waging became clear. This wasn't just a construction project, it was a crusade against the very nature of the city. Bazalgette was about to lead an army of 30,000 men into the dark, wet earth, working beneath the feet of an unsuspecting public to create a hidden world of brick and iron. He stood on the banks of the black, bubbling river, his maps clutched in hand, knowing that the eyes of the world were on him. The great Stink had provided the money and the power, but it was up to Joseph Bazalgette to provide the salvation. The clock was ticking, the summer heat shows no sign of breaking, and the entire future of the imperial capital now rested on his ability to master the flow of its own filth. Joseph Bazalgette did not just suggest a few new pipes, he demanded the total anatomical reconfiguration of London. He stood before a map of a city that was effectively drowning in its own waste and envisioned a system that worked with the geography of the Thames basin rather than against it. His masterwork was centered on the radical concept of interception. For centuries, London's sewers were nothing more than ancient streams and modified gutters that ran north to south, dumping their contents directly into the Thames at high tide. Bazalgette's genius was to turn the entire system 90 degrees. He planned to build massive subterranean boulevards running west to east, positioned at different elevations to catch the effluent before it ever reached the river's edge. To the north of the river, 3 great intercepting sewers would be constructed: the high level, the middle level, and the low level. To the south, a matching pair would mirror the effort. This was a battle won through the mastery of gradients and the relentless pull of physics. Bazalgette calculated that a fall of exactly 2 feet per mile would provide just enough velocity to keep the sewage moving by the power of gravity alone. It was a precarious balance. If the flow was too slow, the silt would settle and block the pipe. If it was too fast, the friction of the grit would wear away the brickwork. This was a delicate, silent march of filth, sliding toward the sea beneath the feet of an oblivious public, driven by nothing more than the natural slope of the London basin. But gravity has its limits. In the low-lying reaches of the East End and the marshes of the South, the land flattened out, and the waste eventually dropped below the level of the river. To push it back up and out toward the estuary, Bazalgette designed what can only be described as palaces of industry. The pumping stations at Abbey Mills and Crossness were not merely functional sheds, they were triumphs of Victorian engineering and aesthetic pride. Built in the ornate Byzantine and Italianate styles, these cathedrals of sewage housed massive steam-driven beam engines, the largest in the world, capable of lifting thousands of tons of liquid per minute. Inside, the roar of the massive iron pistons and the hiss of steam provided the heartbeat for a city finally beginning to breathe again. These engines, with their intricate floral ironwork and polished brass, treated the management of waste as a noble, almost holy endeavor. The sheer physical reality of this undertaking remains staggering even by modern standards. The project required the firing and manual laying of 318 million bricks. Bazalgette was a notorious perfectionist, obsessed with the integrity of his materials. He knew that the sulfuric acid produced by the waste would devour inferior stone, so he subjected every batch of bricks to rigorous quality control. He also turned to a relatively new and unproven substance to bind these millions of bricks together: Portland cement. This was a pivotal moment in civil engineering history. By insisting on this stronger, water-resistant concrete, he ensured that his tunnels would not just last for decades, but for centuries. Over 670,000 cubic meters of concrete were poured into the London soil, creating a hidden, indestructible skeleton that holds the city together to this day. Nowhere was the ambition of the plan more visible than along the banks of the Thames itself. To house the low-level intercepting sewers, Bazalgette didn't just dig a trench, he moved the river. He reclaimed 52 acres of land from the muddy, tidal foreshore to create the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments. This was terraforming on a grand scale. He pushed back the water with massive granite walls, narrowing the river channel to increase the speed of the current and provide a natural scouring power. Within these new embankments, he layered the city's future in a complex vertical stack: the intercepting sewer at the very bottom, the newly conceived district line of the London Underground above it, and a broad tree-lined boulevard on the surface. It was a three-dimensional solution to a crisis that had threatened to extinguish the capital. Tens of thousands of laborers, the legendary navvies, descended into the trenches to make this vision a reality. They worked by candlelight and torchlight, carving through the dense London clay, often just feet away from the foundations of ancient buildings and the cellars of the wealthy. It was dangerous, grueling work, conducted in a subterranean world of damp, darkness, and the constant threat of collapse. Yet, as the tunnels pushed further east, the results were undeniable. The great stink began to recede, not through a single miracle, but through the cumulative effect of miles upon miles of meticulously laid brickwork. Bazalgette was effectively building a second invisible London beneath the first, a shadow city dedicated to the singular task of keeping the imperial capital from suffocating. This was the moment the Victorian era moved from the age of steam into the age of public health, proving that the greatest empire on earth could only survive if it first mastered the flow of its own most basic biological reality. As the granite walls of the Victoria Embankment rose, the Thames was no longer just an open sewer. It was being transformed back into the dignified artery of a global power. But if the embankment was the face of this transformation, the miles of brickwork snaking beneath the city were its hidden, vital organs. Joseph Bazalgette was no longer just an engineer. He had become the conductor of a massive subterranean orchestra, but the music was often drowned out by the sound of pickaxes hitting clay and the roar of the rising tide. Between 1859 and 1865, London was a city under siege from its own ambition. The task was staggering: to construct 82 miles of main intercepting sewers and over 1,000 miles of street sewers. To do this, Bazalgette had to navigate a landscape that was as much a political minefield as it was a geological one. The physical labor was Herculean. Thousands of navvies, the hardened backbone of the Victorian industrial age, descended upon the city. These men lived in the mud, working by the flickering light of tallow candles in cramped, oxygen-deprived tunnels. It was a brutal existence. The weather seemed a constant enemy. Heavy rains frequently flooded the excavations, turning carefully dug trenches into rivers of sludge that threatened to wash away months of progress. When nature wasn't conspiring against them, the workforce was. Labor strikes were a recurring nightmare for the Metropolitan Board of Works. The men knew the city was desperate, and they used that leverage to demand better wages and shorter hours, often halting construction at critical junctures. Bazalgette had to balance the ledger of a tightening budget against the reality that without these men, London would remain choked by its own waste. Then there was the matter of the materials themselves. Bazalgette was obsessed with longevity. He knew that if this system failed, there would be no second chance. This led to his famous and at the time controversial insistence on the use of Portland cement. It was a relatively new material, often unreliable and prone to poor mixing. Bazalgette instituted a rigorous testing regime that was practically unheard of in the mid-19th century. Every batch of cement brought to the site was sampled and tested for its tensile strength. If a single cask didn't meet his exacting standards, the entire shipment was rejected. The contractors grumbled at the cost and the delays, but Bazalgette remained unmoved. He was building for the centuries, not the seasons. This obsession with quality control ultimately transformed Portland cement from a niche product into the global standard for civil engineering. But in 1860, it was just another hurdle in a project already behind schedule. As the tunnels pushed deeper under the city, the danger escalated. The engineers were tunneling beneath a living, breathing metropolis. They had to weave their brick arteries around the foundations of ancient churches, through the tangled roots of slums, and over the top of the world's first underground railway, which was being excavated at the same time. One wrong calculation could send a row of houses collapsing into the earth. There were constant fears of gas explosions as pockets of ancient, trapped methane were disturbed by the workmen's lamps. The smell of the old cesspools still permeated the earth, a constant reminder of the invisible killer they were trying to outrun. Yet, amidst the mud and the danger, the Victorians found a way to celebrate their industrial triumph through art. As the system neared completion, the focus shifted to the points where the waste would be lifted and moved toward the sea. These were the pumping stations, but to call them mere utility buildings would be an insult to the Victorian psyche. At Abbey Mills and Crossness, Bazalgette and his architects created what can only be described as cathedrals of sewage. At Crossness, on the southern marshes, the exterior of the building looked like a grand gentleman's manor, but the interior was a temple to the machine age. Here, the utilitarian task of pumping millions of gallons of effluent was housed within a riot of Byzantine and Gothic splendor. Massive iron columns were topped with intricately carved capitals depicting leaves and fruit. The ironwork was painted in vibrant reds, golds, and blues. 4 enormous beam engines, named after members of the royal family, stood as the high altars of this temple. These engines were the largest of their kind in the world, marvels of brass and steel that moved with a rhythmic, silent grace. This wasn't just vanity. To the Victorians, these ornate stations were a physical manifestation of the gospel of work. They believed that even the most reviled aspects of human existence, the waste and the filth, could be redeemed through engineering and beauty. It was a statement of supreme confidence. If the Great Stink had been a moment of national shame, these pumping stations were the monument to their redemption. They were proof that a global power did not just conquer foreign lands, it conquered its own shadows, turning the very source of its sickness into a display of industrial majesty. By 1865, as the engines began to hum and the first great flows of waste were diverted away from the heart of the city, London held its breath, waiting to see if Bazalgette's gamble would finally clear the air. The wait was not a long one. On a crisp April morning in 1865, the industrial might of the Victorian age converged on a marshy stretch of the Thames at Crossness. It was a day of high fashion and heavy iron. The Prince of Wales himself, the future King Edward VII, stood atop a platform surrounded by the most powerful figures of the British Empire. This was no mere ribbon-cutting for a new road or a bridge. This was the baptism of a subterranean world, an underground cathedral built of 318 million bricks and filled with the most sophisticated machinery the world had ever seen. When the prince turned the gold-plated handle to start the massive beam engines, the ground beneath their feet began to throb with a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. It was the sound of a city finally learning how to breathe. As the great flywheels began to spin, lifting thousands of gallons of effluent every minute, the victory was almost instantaneous. Within weeks, the physical transformation of the city was undeniable. The thick, viscous sludge that had choked the Thames for decades began to thin. The tides, which had once merely shuttled human waste back and forth through the heart of Westminster, now pushed against a river that was slowly reclaiming its clarity. The great intercepting sewers were doing exactly what Joseph Bazalgette had promised. They were catching the poison before it could ever touch the water that flowed past the windows of Parliament. The Great Stink, which had paralyzed the government and sent the wealthy fleeing to the countryside, was being sucked away into the massive tunnels, channeled miles downstream to be released where the tide would carry it out to the sea. Londoners who had spent years walking with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces began to lower their guard. They stood on the newly constructed embankments, marveling at the lack of odor. The air, which had been thick with the scent of rot and decay, was suddenly neutral, even fresh. But as the air cleared, something even more profound happened. A shadow that had loomed over London for the better part of the century began to lift. For decades, the city had lived in terror of the Blue Death. Cholera would arrive like a ghost, sweeping through crowded tenements and grand villas alike, leaving thousands of blue-tinted corpses in its wake. Most of the men standing on that platform in 1865 still believed the disease was carried on the wind, a product of the very smell they had just managed to suppress. They were followers of the miasma theory, convinced that if you removed the stench, you removed the sickness. This created one of the most remarkable ironies in the history of medicine and engineering. Joseph Bazalgette had built his masterpiece to fight a phantom. He was designing for the nose, not for the microscope. He believed, as did most of his contemporaries, that by draining the marshes and flushing the sewers, he was removing the airborne miasma that caused disease. Yet, by some miracle of engineering and accidental foresight, his solution was exactly what the advocates of the germ theory had been screaming for. While Bazalgette was busy moving the smell, he was simultaneously removing the source of the bacteria that lived in the water. He was cleaning the drinking supply by default. He had built a fortress against a disease he did not fully understand. The proof of this success arrived with a chilling precision just 1 year later. In 1866, a small, localized cholera outbreak flared up in the East End, in the area of Bromley by Bow. In any other year, this would have been the spark that set the entire city on fire. But this time, the fire stayed contained. Investigations revealed that this specific district was the one part of the city not yet fully integrated into Bazalgette's new system. Everywhere else, where the new sewers were operational, the death toll was 0. It was the ultimate, undeniable validation. The link between the waste in the water and the death in the streets had been severed. London had gambled its entire fortune on a network of tunnels it would never see, and the gamble had paid off beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The city stopped being a death trap and started becoming a modern metropolis. The Thames was no longer an open sewer, but once again a river. As the Prince of Wales and his entourage departed Crossness that day, they left behind a city that had not only cured its most pressing embarrassment, but had inadvertently discovered the secret to urban survival. The smell was gone, the air was sweet, and for the first time in generations, the people of London could drink from their taps without peering into the abyss. Bazalgette's gamble had not just cleared the air, it had saved the heart of the empire. But the transformation of London didn't stop at the water's edge. As the last of the great intercepting sewers were sealed and the pumps at Crossness began their rhythmic iron pulse, the city above started to undergo a physical metamorphosis that was just as radical as the one taking place beneath the cobblestones. The river, once a sprawling, lazy expanse of tidal mud and industrial refuse, was being forcibly restrained. For centuries, the Thames had been an unpredictable neighbor, its banks shifting with the tides, leaving behind vast, stinking flats of gray slime whenever the water receded. Bazalgette realized that his massive pipes needed a home, and the soft, unstable mud of the riverbank wasn't going to suffice. To protect his work and provide a foundation for his interceptors, he didn't just build a sewer, he built a new shoreline. The construction of the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments was perhaps the most visible legacy of the Great Stink. It was an act of terraforming on a Victorian scale. Engineers drove massive iron cofferdams into the riverbed, pumping out the water to create dry enclosures where armies of laborers could work. They laid down millions of bricks and faced them with enormous blocks of gray granite, effectively narrowing the river to force it to run faster and cleaner. In doing so, Bazalgette reclaimed 37 acres of land from the muck. This wasn't just a technical necessity, it was an urban revolution. Where there had once been rotting wharves and treacherous mud, there were now broad, elegant boulevards. Walking along the Victoria Embankment today, it is easy to forget that this land simply did not exist before 1860. The wide roads provided a vital new artery for a city choking on horse-drawn traffic, while the river-facing side was adorned with ornamental gardens and rows of London plane trees, specifically chosen for their ability to thrive in the soot-heavy air. The embankment became the city's new front porch, a place for the public to stroll and breathe air that no longer carried the scent of death. But the beauty of the surface was a clever mask. Tucked neatly beneath the granite and the flower beds were the great main sewers, the subway for gas and water pipes, and even the tracks of the district line. It was the birth of the modern, layered city, where infrastructure was hidden from view to allow the aesthetics of the metropolis to shine. Yet, as the physical scars of the Great Stink faded and the cholera outbreaks became a dark memory of a less enlightened age, a strange silence began to settle over the man who had orchestrated it all. In a society that obsessed over its heroes, Joseph Bazalgette occupied a precarious position. The Victorians were masters of the monument. They erected soaring columns to their admirals and massive bronze statues to their generals. They celebrated the men who expanded the borders of the empire through gunpowder and grit. But Bazalgette was an engineer, a man of calculations and cement, and his battlefield was the gutter. There is a profound, almost tragic irony in how the public perceived his contribution. While a military hero might be credited with saving the nation from a foreign invader, Bazalgette had saved the nation from itself. The numbers are staggering. In the decades following the completion of his system, the death rate in London plummeted. Typhoid and cholera, which had once claimed tens of thousands of lives in a single summer, were virtually eradicated from the capital. By any objective measure, Joseph Bazalgette saved more lives than any other figure of the 19th century. He did more for the longevity of the British people than any surgeon, any politician, or any monarch. And yet, when he walked the streets of London in his later years, he was not mobbed by grateful crowds. There were no parades in his honor. To the average Londoner of the late 1800s, the sewer system was a triumph that was best left unthought of. It dealt with the visceral, the unpleasant, and the unmentionable. To celebrate the man who managed the city's waste was to acknowledge the waste itself, and the Victorian middle class preferred to look at the new gardens and the granite walls rather than contemplate what was flowing beneath their feet. Even today, Bazalgette remains a ghost in the city he built. While the Duke of Wellington towers over Hyde Park Corner, Bazalgette's primary memorial is a modest, elegant bust tucked away on the Victoria Embankment, often overlooked by the thousands of commuters who hurry past it every morning. He was a man of quiet, relentless industry, a person who found his satisfaction in the precision of a brick arch rather than the roar of a crowd. He never sought the spotlight, and in return, history has treated him with a polite, distant respect rather than the fervor reserved for the masters of war. This lack of celebrity reflects a deeper truth about the nature of public health. When a sewer system works, it is invisible. Success is defined by the absence of crisis. If the water runs clear and the air stays sweet, the engineer is forgotten. It is only in failure that their name is shouted from the rooftops. Bazalgette's gamble had been so successful, his engineering so robust, that he rendered himself redundant in the public imagination. He had solved the problem so thoroughly that people forgot there had ever been a problem to solve. The Great Stink became a punchline in old copies of Punch magazine, a quaint anecdote from a cruder time, rather than the existential threat that had once brought the most powerful government on earth to its knees. The embankments changed the map of London, turning a chaotic river into a structured urban landscape, but they also served as a monument to a specific kind of Victorian confidence. It was the belief that any problem, no matter how foul or how vast, could be solved through the application of logic, labor, and a staggering amount of masonry. Bazalgette's legacy isn't just the pipes or the granite. It is the very survival of London as a global capital. Without him, the city would have likely collapsed under the weight of its own growth, a victim of its own success. He didn't just clear the air, he provided the foundation upon which the modern world was built, even if that foundation remains buried in the dark, silent tunnels beneath the feet of a city that has largely forgotten his name. The city above is loud, frantic, and obsessed with the new. It glitters with glass towers and high-frequency trading, a metropolis of 9 million souls moving at the speed of fiber optics. Yet just a few feet beneath the pavement, the air grows heavy and the temperature drops. Here, the Victorian brickwork still holds. Those dark, silent tunnels are not mere relics or archaeological curiosities. They are the working arteries of a living giant. Joseph Bazalgette may be a name lost to the history books, but his handiwork remains the most vital organ in the body of London. For over a century and a half, his system has performed a silent miracle every single day, whisking away the waste of an empire with a reliability that borders on the supernatural. He built for a future he could barely imagine, over-engineering his tunnels to accommodate a population of 4 million people, a figure that seemed preposterous in the 1860s. He gave London a margin of safety that lasted longer than the British Empire itself. But even the greatest engineering marvels eventually reach a breaking point. Today, London has long since outgrown that margin. The population has doubled, and the city's footprint has expanded into a concrete sprawl that refuses to absorb a single drop of rain. When Bazalgette designed his combined sewer system, he included overflow points, safety valves that would release diluted sewage into the Thames during rare, catastrophic storms to prevent the tunnels from bursting or backing up into homes. In the mid-19th century, these overflows happened perhaps half a dozen times a year. Now they happen almost every week. It no longer takes a biblical deluge to trigger a spill. A heavy afternoon shower is often enough to overwhelm the system. When that happens, the gates open and millions of tons of raw, untreated waste pour directly into the river, turning the modern Thames back into the open sewer it was supposed to have outgrown. The ghost of the Great Stink still haunts the water, a reminder that we are only ever one storm away from the squalor of the past. It isn't just the volume of water that threatens the integrity of these Victorian veins. It is the nature of our waste. Bazalgette's sewers were built for a world of organic matter and gravity. They were not built for the era of plastic, synthetic fibers, and the flushable wet wipe. Deep in the sewers of Whitechapel and Chelsea, modern monsters have taken root. Massively solidified blocks of cooking fat, oil, and non-biodegradable debris, famously known as fatbergs, clog the tunnels like cholesterol in an aging heart. Some of these deposits grow to the length of 2 football pitches, weighing hundreds of tons. They are a uniquely modern plague, a physical manifestation of a society that consumes without thought and discards without consequence. while crews work in the dark with shovels and high-pressure hoses to break these blockages apart, the city above remains blissfully unaware that its basic functionality is being defended in a literal war of attrition. Recognizing that the Victorian foundation is finally at capacity, London has begun work on its most ambitious engineering project since the days of Bazalgette himself. It is called the Thames Tideway Tunnel, the Super Sewer. This is a massive 25-kilometer-long concrete artery, some 67 meters underground, tracing the curve of the river from west to east. To see it during construction is to witness a cathedral of civil engineering. The tunnel is wide enough for 3 double-decker buses to drive through side by side. It is designed to capture the overflows that currently pollute the river and funnel them to advanced treatment plants downstream. It is a staggering feat of modern technology, using massive boring machines and precision GPS, yet its purpose is exactly the same as the brick-and-mortar tunnels of the 1860s. We are, in effect, finishing the job Bazalgette started, reinforcing the city's guts for the next century of growth. The scale of the Tideway project is a testament to the sheer difficulty of maintaining a modern city. Thousands of engineers and laborers work around the clock, carving through the London clay, navigating a subterranean obstacle course of tube lines, power cables, and existing water mains. It is a multi-billion-pound investment in something that the public will never see, a project that offers no aesthetic glory and no architectural awards. It is pure utility, a necessary evolution to ensure the Thames remains a river rather than a wasteland. It reminds us that every great civilization is only as stable as the systems it buries beneath its feet. There is a strange paradox in the way we view infrastructure. The more successful a system is, the more invisible it becomes. We celebrate the architects who design the skylines we can see, but we ignore the engineers who manage the depths we cannot. We take for granted the fact that when we turn a tap, clean water arrives, and when we flush a toilet, the problem disappears forever. This collective amnesia is a luxury afforded to us by the genius of the past. We only think about the sewers when they fail, when the smell rises or the streets flood. Otherwise, we prefer to live in a state of high-tech denial, pretending that our civilization exists independently of the messy biological realities of human life. But the river does not forget. The Thames remains a mirror, reflecting our ability to solve the crises of our own making or our failure to look ahead. As the super sewer nears completion and the final bricks of the Victorian era are integrated into this new subterranean world, we are forced to acknowledge the silent contract we have with the earth beneath us. Civilization is not just about art or commerce or the height of our towers. It is about how we handle the things we find repulsive. It is about the hidden tunnels, the steady flow of gravity, and the foresight of those who build for people they will never meet. Joseph Bazalgette's name may be etched in a modest monument on the embankment, often ignored by tourists looking at the London Eye, but his true memorial is the health of the city itself. We continue to walk over his legacy every day, our lives made possible by a vast, dark, and essential kingdom that we refuse to see. As the lights dim in the tunnels and the water begins to flow into the new channels, the city continues its relentless march toward the future, carried on the back of an invisible giant. The stink of 1858 has long since dissipated, but the lesson remains. A city that forgets what lies beneath is a city that cannot sustain what lies above. The water flows on, silent and hidden, as it always has, and as it always must.